Good afternoon, everybody. This is the Whispering Gentleman. So, flick the lights off, sit down in your comfortable chair, and grab a glass of your favorite drink as we dive on into it. My grandfather was a survivor of the Titanic, and he told me what really happened on the voyage by Sugar-soad. I worshipped my grandfather growing up, as he was such a strong presence in my life. Even into his later years, he could remember conversations he had with people almost 20 years ago. I learned from my mother that he was a passenger aboard the Titanic, but refused to ever speak of it with people. I had become obsessed with the story of the sinking, as I wanted to do a presentation on it for my school. My grandfather raised his voice at me for the first time in his life after I begged him to tell me the story. He scolded me, and I was frightened, as I had never seen him act like this. I went to my bedroom and started weeping, as I was just so freaked out by what had happened. He came into my room and apologized for the way he had acted. I could see the regret on his face as I flinched back from him when he tried to hug me. The next morning, I walked downstairs to find him sitting at the table with a look of sadness on his face. He asked me to sit down, and I reluctantly agreed. His face had conflicting emotions as he told me that he would tell me exactly what happened on the Titanic. He made me to promise never to tell anyone, as he was worried people might think he was crazy. I sat there dumbfounded as he started telling me the story. I was only 7 years old when I climbed on board the Titanic. It seemed so gigantic compared to me, and I was struck by how beautiful everything looked. There were so many people everywhere, and they were all so friendly and smiling. I stood at the edge of the ship and waved down at the people on the dock as we prepared to set sail. It was one of the happiest moments in my life, as I had never felt such exhilaration. My parents ushered me to my room when we were underway, as they wanted to enjoy the ship. I knew we had spent most of our money to get tickets, as my parents had always wanted to live in America. I began to notice some strange behavior from some of the other passengers in the second day of the cruise. They seemed to be coughing a lot, and their eyes were very red. My father assured me that it was nothing, but I could remember how frightened he looked. He left for a few minutes and came back carrying a wrench and told me it was for my own protection. I was awoken the next morning by screams coming from the next room. I jumped out of bed and rushed to see what was happening. There were already a group of people standing outside the door, and I pushed them out of the way to get a better view. I froze while staring at the contents of the room. There was a man lying on the floor with his stomach ripped open, while his two young children seemed to be feasting on his intestines. I was shoved out of the way as two of the crew members rushed in. They grabbed the children and struggled to hold them, as the children were like rabid animals. They managed to subdue the children by knocking them out cold. We were ushered back to our room so that they could clean up the mess. I wandered the ship for the day and noticed that a lot of people seemed to be very sick. The crew seemed to be very on edge and were always looking around them. I was woken on the fourth day by screams and running from outside the cabin. I peeked outside and was shocked, as all the hallways were covered in blood. I quickly closed the door and went to wake my parents, but they weren't here. I didn't know what to do, as I was afraid to leave the room, but was afraid to be by myself. I spent a couple hours trying to decide what to do. My rumbling stomach finally convinced me that I needed to leave and find some food. Half the day had already gone, and I had just sat here. I crept to the door and peeked out and was relieved to find the hall empty. There were distant sounds of the engines rumbling and the occasional scream. I remembered that there was a kitchen down the hallway, which would probably have something in it I could eat. It took an eternity for me to move down that corridor, as I was trying to avoid stepping in blood or blood-stained clothes. I reached the kitchen and almost puked while gazing at the corpses inside. They looked like someone had stabbed them hundreds of times. They appeared to be a mixture of crew members and passengers. I grabbed any food that was close at hand and fled. I quickly ate the food that I had acquired and began to search the ship. I kept coming across more corpses along each corridor. Many of them looked like they had their stomachs ripped open. It was beginning to get dark, and I was starting to get worried that everyone else on board was dead. I rounded a corner and my bladder let loose as a gun was pointed in my face. I stood there shaking as one of the crew members gazed at me for a few moments. He put the gun away before rushing off and leaving me standing there all alone. It took me a while to gather my senses, and by this time it was completely dark. I had heard distant gunshots in the direction the crew member had run and wondered what he had shot at. I was thrown to my feet as a deafening crash rocked the ship. I ran to the side and gazed out at an enormous lump of ice which we must have crashed into. Lumps of ice began to crash down beside me, and I had to move away to avoid being hit. I watched as the piece of ice disappeared off into the distance and wondered how bad the damage was. I heard a noise behind me and was instantly relieved to see my father. I began rushing towards him, but I stopped after seeing his clothes were covered in blood. His eyes locked on mine, and I began to shrink back at his gaze. His gaze was that of an animal and not a human. He let out a guttural growl and began to charge at me. I felt my bladder release once again as I awaited my death. My father suddenly went flying backwards, and I turned around to discover the same crew member from earlier still clutching the gun. He looked at me for a few moments and indicated me to follow him. He was moving very quickly, and I was barely able to keep pace. He was peeping around every corner, and we walked by dozens of corpses. We eventually reached an area with a large number of survivors. Some were attempting to lower the lifeboats, while others were trying to fight off the other passengers who seemed to want to eat them. They managed to get the lifeboats down and slowly began to evacuate any survivors. The ship at this point was slowly starting to sink, and it was desperate trying to get as many people to safety as possible. Our lifeboat was moving away from the ship, and I could see dozens of passengers rushing backwards and forwards, just attacking each other. The ship had begun to sink beneath the waves, and most of the people were at the back of the ship. I turned away as I didn't want to see any more of this. There were sniping cries from the others on the boat as none of us could understand what had happened. A few hours later, the other ships arrived and we were rescued. My mother had survived on another lifeboat, and we tearfully reunited. My mother was offered a substantial amount of money by the owners of the Titanic to never say a word, and she agreed. I think most of the other survivors would rather have forgotten this had ever happened, so it was accepted by everyone. I remember reading the newspapers afterwards and wondering if anyone would ever really know what happened. I gazed at my grandfather in shock as he finished the story, as I couldn't believe what I had just heard. He sat there with a tear rolling down his cheek and then swore me to secrecy. I went to bed that night with the intention of asking him more questions in the morning. My mother found his body the next morning. He had suffered a fatal heart attack during the night. I'm posting this now in hopes of finding others who had family members who survived the Titanic. I really want to know the full story of what had happened. If you like this story, check out more of these stories from Sugar-soad on Reddit. As always, sleep tight and stay terrified.